The CEO's daughter fired me with a smile so smug it practically echoed off the glass walls. She thought she'd won. She thought I'd walk out quietly, humiliated, grateful she didn't escort me out with security. What she didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that the moment she said, "We're moving in a different direction," she triggered a clause buried so deep in their contracts that even their legal team had forgotten it existed. A clause I wrote. A clause with teeth. And by the time they realized what I'd unleashed, their $68 million deal was already dead on arrival. I had been with the company for 12 years, director of compliance, the one job nobody cared about until the day something exploded. And trust me, things exploded often. I cleaned up every mess: regulatory breaches, overseas audits, licensing errors, financial reporting slip-ups. My job was to make sure nothing cost the company money. Ironically, that also meant I knew exactly where they were most vulnerable. The CEO knew it, too. He treated me with respect because he understood my value. His daughter, Chloe, she treated me like a relic. Ever since she became VP of Operations, 2 months out of business school and one motivational podcast away from thinking she was a genius, she made it clear she didn't like old guard thinkers. Translation: she didn't like being told no. The firing came the same morning I warned her that the new client contract she wanted fast-tracked needed 2 more compliance checks. She waved me off with the kind of confidence only nepotism could breed. "We're signing it today," she said. I told her that signing without final clearance violated Section 14B of the International Vendor Agreement. I may as well have spoken in Morse code. 3 hours later she called me into her father's office, without him there, and handed me a termination letter. "We need people who move forward," she said. "Not people who slow us down." Fine. If she wanted forward motion, I'd give her some. The moment she said terminated, something inside me loosened, something I'd been quietly holding for years. Because the compliance retention contract I created during a restructuring 5 years ago had one fascinating sentence tucked into its legalese: any executive decision that ignored compliance advisories and resulted in my termination required immediate reclassification of all pending deals under critical risk review. And critical risk review meant every deal froze. Every meeting halted. Every closing suspended until the board personally signed off with a unanimous vote. And the board? They were across the world at a summit. Chloe had accidentally hit the company's self-destruct button. I didn't say anything dramatic. Just nodded, thanked her, handed over my badge, and walked out with the calm certainty of someone who knew the next 48 hours would be catastrophic, but not for me. On my way out, I sent the final compliance termination notice to the system. It triggered instantly. Red banners across dashboards. Automatic notifications to legal, operations, finance, and procurement. You could practically hear the gears grinding to a halt. And then I left the building and went for a quiet coffee. By that evening, my phone was vibrating nonstop. I didn't answer a single call. The next morning, word had already leaked through former colleagues. The client, an international tech firm, was furious. Their attorneys saw the critical risk freeze and immediately flagged the contract as unstable. The $68 million deal they were about to sign? Withdrawn. They said they wouldn't work with a company that couldn't maintain internal compliance alignment. Chloe had tanked the biggest signing of the quarter before lunchtime. And the best part? The board finally flew back early, not because of the deal collapsing, but because of what the automatic audit report revealed. Every step of this disaster traced directly back to Chloe's override of my compliance halt. The system made sure of it. The clause I wrote handed them a beautifully organized timeline of her decisions, complete with her digital signatures authorizing every breach. By the time they reached her office, she was already crying, insisting she didn't know, she wasn't told, she was trying to be innovative. They demoted her before lunch. Officially for reckless operational conduct. Unofficially for arrogance paired with incompetence, a fatal corporate combination. And me? The CEO called 3 times. Then emailed. Then finally texted, "We need to talk. Please." I replied politely that I was no longer available for employment opportunities but wished him the best. As for the clause that killed their $68 million deal, it expired the moment HR filed my final paperwork. One-time use only. A quiet protection mechanism I created in case someone ever tried to remove me for doing the job they hired me to do. Turns out it worked perfectly. Chloe learned the hard way that some positions can't be replaced with favoritism. And some people, especially the ones who keep the whole machine from collapsing, aren't nearly as powerless as they look. Not every battle has to be loud. Some victories come from knowing exactly which string to pull, and watching the whole tower fall by itself. 2 days after the deal collapsed, I got an unexpected call, not from the CEO, not from HR, but from the client whose contract Chloe had mangled. Their general counsel left a brief message asking me to return the call at my convenience. I almost let it go to voicemail permanently, but curiosity won. When I called back, she didn't waste time. She told me they had reviewed the audit logs and realized the contract freeze wasn't incompetence, it was a safeguard. A safeguard I designed. She then said something that made me sit up straighter. "We prefer partners who build systems that protect the company, not just themselves. We think you might fit somewhere here." I'd barely unpacked the box from my former desk, and here was a billion-dollar firm asking if I'd consider stepping into a strategic compliance director role. A role that paid more than I'd ever earned. A role that didn't treat compliance like a bureaucracy, but like the backbone it actually is. For the first time in years, someone actually understood what I brought to the table. Meanwhile, back at my old company, things weren't stabilizing, they were detonating in waves. Chloe wasn't just demoted, internal chatter said she'd been moved to an advisory role. Everyone knew what that meant, a fancy title with zero authority. The board wasn't done either. Once they dug deeper, they discovered she'd overridden at least 6 compliance flags in the past quarter alone. Some were minor. One wasn't. A licensing lapse in Singapore that could result in a 7-figure fine. It hadn't triggered yet, but the fact that she'd buried the warning made the board furious. They weren't just angry about the $68 million deal, they were angry at what else she might have broken without realizing it. My inbox filled with messages from former coworkers, each more dramatic than the last. One wrote, "Please tell me you cursed her on your way out," and another said, "She's blaming the old processes for everything." But the most telling message came from a usually quiet analyst who simply wrote, "You weren't the problem. You were the plug in the dam. It burst the moment you left." And that was the truth. The place hadn't fallen apart because I destroyed it. It fell apart because I was the only thing holding it together while leadership played pretend. A week later, the CEO finally reached me, not to hire me back, but to apologize. A full, unfiltered apology. He admitted he'd given his daughter too much authority, too fast. He admitted he'd ignored warnings, including ones I'd sent directly to him. And he admitted that firing me was the single worst managerial decision he'd ever allowed to happen. But here's the thing, I didn't need his apology. I didn't want his job back. And I sure as hell didn't want to step back into a building that treated experience like an inconvenience. So I thanked him for reaching out, wished him luck, and let the silence hang long enough that he understood the door wasn't just closed, it was locked, sealed, and bricked over. By the end of that month, I had signed a new contract with the client firm who recognized my work. My salary doubled. My authority was clear. My work was respected. And I didn't have to fight a 27-year-old VP who thought leadership meant ignore anyone older than you. The best part? My new office had a view wide, open, full of possibility. A view that felt like the opposite of everything I'd endured. And on my first day, as I sat down in my new chair, I got one last message from a former coworker. A single line: "Chloe resigned today." They said she wanted to explore new opportunities. We all know what that means. I smiled. Because some people fall because they're pushed. But others fall simply because no one is there to hold them up anymore. And sometimes the greatest revenge is stepping away and watching the empire that fired you collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. What surprised me most wasn't that the company continued to stumble without me, it was how quickly the consequences multiplied. Within 2 months, the place I once carried on my back had become a revolving door of resignations. Senior analysts left first, people who'd been quietly enduring Chloe's leadership style because they trusted me to keep the ship steady. Once I was gone, they saw the writing on the wall. Without anyone in compliance who actually understood the international regs, chaos became a daily visitor. Then the regulators came knocking. Remember that licensing lapse in Singapore? Well, Singapore didn't shrug it off. They issued a notice of violation that required immediate remediation, something the company couldn't perform because Chloe had dismantled half the compliance workflows I designed. They had to hire a third-party consulting group at triple the cost just to get back to baseline. And even they couldn't believe the internal dismantling that had taken place. One consultant bluntly told a former colleague, "You people fired the only person who knew how your systems worked." But the biggest blow landed in a way none of them anticipated. The client who hired me wasn't just any client, they were expanding fast. And as part of their expansion, they began buying up failing or unstable competitors to build a network of integrated partners. Guess who suddenly appeared on their acquisition radar? My old company. All their financial stumbles, legal bottlenecks, and internal instability had become public enough that they looked like prime takeover material, ripe for acquisition but cheap enough to be considered a bargain. I wasn't part of the acquisition team, but I sat in on one meeting as a subject matter expert for a related regulatory package. I didn't say a word about my former employer, but the moment their name flashed on the screen, something quiet and cold settled in my chest. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just clarity. Clarity that this was what happens when a leadership team runs a company like a vanity project instead of a business. And then came the irony of ironies. Their CEO, Chloe's father, requested a private conversation with my new CEO. Not to block the acquisition, but to beg for a partnership instead. He wasn't ready to be swallowed up, and he hoped an alliance would buy them time. My new CEO listened, polite and expressionless, and simply said, "We'll consider whatever makes business sense." Business sense. The same phrase I used to say to Chloe every time she dismissed a compliance warning. Meanwhile, from the inside, things were only getting worse. Former coworkers told me that Chloe, after resigning, had tried to start her own small consulting venture. It failed within a month. She had no client base, no expertise, and, most importantly, no one willing to vouch for her professionalism. Word travels fast in corporate circles, especially when millions hang in the balance. One afternoon, months into my new role, I ran into one of my old team members at a conference. She hugged me like someone who had escaped a burning building. She told me the office atmosphere had become post-apocalyptic, with rumors that the board was preparing to dissolve half the executive team. Hearing it, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt done. That place was no longer my battle. No longer my weight to carry. No longer my responsibility to fix. But deep down, in a place I rarely let myself acknowledge, there was a quiet truth. The foundation I had built, meticulous, resilient, unshakable, was the only thing that had kept that company alive for years. And once they pushed me out, the cracks they ignored finally had room to break open. And the collapse had only just begun. The first real collapse didn't come from regulators, or finances, or even clients. It came from inside, at the board level. Boards are like silent judges, they say little, but they watch everything. And once the acquisition rumors leaked, they started digging hard. Everything Chloe had signed off on, every shortcut she took, every file she retroactively approved without understanding the legal implications, it all surfaced like bones rising from the dirt after a storm. One board member, the kind of man who never raised his voice, reportedly slammed a folder on the table during a meeting and said, "Why were we never told about any of this?" The CEO didn't have an answer. He was a man who'd built his entire identity on appearing in control, and suddenly he was being cornered by mistakes he didn't even know existed, because the one person who used to warn him was gone. My phone buzzed around that time with messages from people I used to mentor. "We're losing major clients. Chloe's systems are falling apart. The board is doing internal audits. Everyone is panicking." I'd always cared about the team, the real employees, the ones who put in the work, so hearing the fear in their words tugged at something in me. But another part of me was steady, unshaken. I had spent too many years cleaning up other people's messes while being treated as if my labor was invisible. Now the truth was visible to everyone, and it was larger than any grudge, larger than any revenge plot. It was simply inevitable. And then, the domino fell that no one expected, not even me. My new company officially submitted an acquisition interest letter. A polite, formal document. Short. Direct. Deadly. It wasn't a hostile takeover, yet. But it was a clear signal that the market saw my old company as bleeding out. The moment the letter landed in their inbox, panic exploded. My old CEO called an emergency all-hands meeting, his voice shaking as he tried to reassure employees that everything was under control. It wasn't. Clients began pulling out. Vendors demanded early payments. The bank tightened their credit line. And the staff, already exhausted, started sending out resumes like lifeboats from a sinking ship. But the part that made people talk? The part that spread through the industry like wildfire? The board removed Chloe's father from the CEO position. A clean, brutal vote. No ceremony. No farewell speech. Just a security escort and a silent elevator ride downward. Everyone who had placed blind loyalty above competence suddenly found themselves exposed. The company announced an interim leadership team, but it was too little, too late. Their reputation had taken a beating, their finances weren't far behind. Meanwhile, I carried on with my new life, calmer, clearer, and building something that had room for my expertise instead of suffocating it. But one evening, while reviewing documents for an expansion project, an email came through from someone I hadn't heard from in almost a year. A name that made me pause. Not Chloe. Not her father. Someone else who had been watching quietly from the sidelines. And the moment I opened it, I realized the story wasn't over. Not for them. Not for me. And certainly not for the truth that was about to surface next. The email was from Marianne Holt, the company's former chief compliance officer. A woman who played everything by the book, lived and breathed regulation, and had once told me, half-jokingly, if anyone ever sinks this company, it'll be because they underestimated the fine print. I clicked her message. "I think you'll want to see what Chloe did after you left. A board member leaked part of the internal investigation. Call me. Urgent." I leaned back in my chair, my pulse steady but slow. If Marianne was reaching out, it wasn't gossip. It wasn't bitterness. It was a warning. She was not the type to get involved unless something serious, and I mean existential, was brewing. I called her. She answered on the first ring, her voice low, almost whispering, like she was speaking from a closet. "They're trying to pin the contract failure on you." The words landed like cold steel, not because they hurt, but because they revealed how desperate the company had become. "On me?" I said. "When they changed the contract terms without review?" "That's the point," she replied. "They didn't review anything. Chloe approved amendments she didn't understand and filed 2 fraudulent certifications just to push the deal through faster. The board found out. And someone, probably trying to protect her, suggested you were the reason the partner withdrew." A slow breath left me. Of course. When things burn, people reach for anyone they can throw into the fire. "But the board didn't believe it," Marianne continued. "They hired an external firm. They're digging through 8 months of records, and the findings," she trailed off. "It's worse than you think." "How much worse?" I asked. She sighed, the kind of sigh that only comes from seeing a disaster unfold frame by frame. Chloe wasn't just incompetent. She falsified timestamps, deleted internal memos, and authorized payments without secondary approval. And when the auditors traced the mess, every trail led back to decisions she made immediately after firing you. "And now they're desperate to rewrite history," I said. "They're not going to get the chance." Her tone sharpened. "The investigators found something big. Something criminal. It's going to explode." There it was, the quiet click of fate locking into place. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Just stay available," she said. "This is going to hit the public. And when it does, they'll come crawling." We hung up, and for a moment, I just watched the city from my office window, cars inching through traffic, lights flickering on across buildings, the whole skyline unaware of the corporate earthquake forming under it. The next morning, it happened. An industry news outlet, the kind executives read before checking their email, published a bombshell: internal investigation finds fraud, misconduct, and contract manipulation at Caraway Industries. My old company. Front page headline. Screenshots. Audit excerpts. Direct quotes from investigators. And buried halfway down the article, bold as truth, misconduct tied to decisions made by newly promoted executive Chloe Myers. Not me. Not the scapegoat they hoped for. Her. By noon, the article had been shared across every platform. By evening, a second outlet confirmed the story. By the next morning, 3 board members had resigned, and employees were leaking internal chaos anonymously. And at the center of the storm, Chloe finally made a move. She showed up at my new office. Unannounced. Panicked. Eyes red. Breathing uneven. Security buzzed to let me know someone was demanding to see me. I stepped into the lobby, and there she was, the woman who had fired me, with a smirk, certain the world bent to her father's shadow. She looked like it had all caught up to her at once. "Please," she said, voice cracking, "I need your help." And I stood there, calm as a still lake, knowing this moment had been waiting for her since the day she signed the papers she didn't understand. I didn't move at first. I just watched her, the same way you watch someone who finally realizes the cliff edge wasn't a step but a drop. Chloe had always walked like the world would adjust for her mistakes. Now she looked like she had aged a decade in a day. "Please," she repeated, softer this time, "can we talk? Somewhere private?" I let the silence hang. Not to punish her, but to give her a moment to feel the weight of the consequences she'd always assumed others would carry. Finally, I nodded toward a small conference room off the lobby. She stepped inside quickly, like she was afraid someone would see her. When the door closed, she sank into a chair, wrapped her arms around herself, and whispered, "They're saying I committed fraud." Fraud. You know I didn't mean, intent isn't the standard, I said. My voice wasn't cruel, it was factual. The certifications you filed were legally binding. The moment you signed them without reading, you crossed the line. Her eyes flicked up, watery, desperate. But you know I didn't understand those clauses. You were supposed to walk me through. I cut her off with one raised hand. You fired me before you even opened the contract. She swallowed hard, like she was trying to swallow back the shame. Or the fear. They want to make me the fall person, she said. The board. The investigators. Even my dad. He said I embarrassed him publicly. Her voice broke. He's not protecting me. There it was. The one truth she had never learned until now: nepotism is only loyalty when it's convenient. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. They said the only person who can clarify the timeline is you. If you confirm that I made decisions without consulting anyone, I'm finished. But if you help me, if you tell them we reviewed things together, or that I acted based on your guidance, I laughed. Quiet. Controlled. She winced. You want me to lie to federal investigators? I asked. To protect you from your own decisions? I'm begging you, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. I don't want to go to jail. There it was, the real fear. Not losing her job. Not losing her father's approval. Not humiliation. Jail. I sat across from her, elbows on the table, and spoke plainly. When you fired me, you said the company needed people who didn't hide behind procedure. Those procedures are the only thing protecting executives from prison. Her chin trembled. If you help me, she said, I'll fix everything. I'll tell them the firing was a mistake. I'll get you your old job back. I shook my head once. I don't want my job back, I said. And even if I did, I wouldn't trade my integrity for it. The room went still. You don't understand, she whispered. My dad said if the investigators think I acted alone, they're handing everything to the state. He said there's nothing he can do. For the first time, she wasn't entitled, arrogant, or condescending. She was just terrified. Chloe, I said, leaning back, I won't lie for you. I won't destroy my reputation because you didn't read the things you signed. She looked like she might collapse. But I will tell the truth. Her eyes opened, a flicker of hope. You will? Yes, I said. I'll tell them you fired me before any decisions were made. I'll tell them you changed the workflow without oversight. I'll tell them you rejected resubmission reviews. I'll tell them you dismissed risk counsel. I'll tell them you ignored compliance warnings because you wanted the deal closed fast. The hope drained from her face like water through a sieve. That was the truth, and she knew it. She stood slowly, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. So, that's it? You're just going to let them ruin me? No, I said quietly. You ruined yourself. I'm just not covering it up. She stared at me for a long moment, the kind of stare that happens when a person sees the end of the road they built with their own decisions. And then she left, shoulders slumped, each step heavier than the last. I watched her walk out of the building, swallowed by the gray morning light. By noon, investigators called me. By evening, my statement was formally logged. By the end of the week, the headline hit every business outlet: CEO's daughter implicated in $68 million fraud case, whistleblower evidence confirms misconduct. And somewhere inside her father's empire, the golden child finally learned the truth: power protects you, until it doesn't. The morning after the headlines hit, my phone buzzed nonstop: old coworkers, former clients, even people I barely remembered from conferences. Some messages were congratulations, some shock, some pure gossip. But the one message I expected never came. Chloe didn't reach out again. By midweek, the building buzzed with rumors that she had been escorted out of the headquarters through the side entrance, away from cameras. The board meeting she'd once walked into like royalty had lasted 8 minutes. She was removed from all operational authority, stripped of signing privileges, and placed on administrative leave pending federal review. 8 minutes to undo 8 years of entitlement. Her father, the CEO, kept quiet publicly, but word leaked that he'd spent the entire weekend trying to negotiate with investigators, not to save her career, but to shield the company. When loyalty and reputation collided, he chose the one that wouldn't cost him shareholders. That's when the final blow landed. A formal request came through. My presence was required at the SEC hearing. The company's lawyers expected me to show up hesitant, maybe resentful, maybe even unstable after being wrongfully fired. They didn't understand something Chloe never understood either. When you've done things the right way your entire career, you don't walk into a courtroom afraid. You walk in prepared. I sat straight, answered every question clearly, provided documentation, time-stamped messages, revision notes, archived review logs, all the things Chloe had deleted or ignored. The legal team barely lasted 20 minutes before they shifted into damage control mode. Her father sat on the far side of the table, jaw clenched so tight the muscles vibrated. He avoided my eyes until the session adjourned. When we finally stood, he approached me, the first time he'd spoken directly to me in months. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "She told me she handled everything. That you were unnecessary." I let him sit with that. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. Humbled. Forced to face the cost of promoting someone based on bloodline instead of competence. "You built this place," he said. "I should have treated you better." I didn't respond. Some truths don't need confirmation. They only need to land. He swallowed, then asked the question I knew had been clawing at him since the board turned on his daughter. Is there any way she avoids prison? The answer wasn't cruel, just honest. That depends on whether she accepts responsibility, I said. But she's out of the industry. This won't be a slap on the wrist. He nodded once, eyes heavy. Not angry at me. Angry at the mess his own decisions created. By the end of the month, the company issued a formal apology, not to me by name, of course, but to all employees affected by leadership mismanagement. Classic corporate language, but everyone internally knew what it meant. Within the quarter, I'd accepted a senior federal oversight position. Ironically, I now review deals larger than the one Chloe tanked, and companies treat my signature like gold. As for her, the last update came quietly. Her plea deal carried no prison time, but it did include a lifetime ban from holding any executive or fiduciary role. She lost the career she never actually built, the influence she never earned, and the protection she always assumed was guaranteed. In the end, she wasn't destroyed by revenge. She was destroyed by accountability. And the most poetic part? The clause she failed to read, the one that killed the $68 million deal, was the same clause designed to prevent unqualified executives from making reckless decisions. She signed her own downfall. Literally. In the months that followed, the company rebuilt itself piece by piece, new leadership, new oversight, new policies written by people who actually knew what they were doing. Every headline that once dragged them across the financial press slowly faded into a cautionary tale cited in business schools and compliance seminars. But Chloe's name, that one stayed etched into every what not to do slide deck for years. She tried to get back into the corporate world, but the ban shut every door before she could even knock. Eventually, word reached me that she'd moved to another state, started a small consulting business, and kept her last name off everything she touched. The industry she grew up believing she'd inherit no longer had space for her, not because of me, but because of the choices she made when she thought she'd never be held accountable. And me? I didn't just recover, I thrived. The federal position came with influence, stability, respect, and a team that valued my insight more in 1 month than Chloe had in her entire tenure. I traveled, lectured, advised, and shaped policies that prevented people like her from ever pulling the same reckless stunts again. Every now and then, someone from my old company reached out, usually to update me on how much smoother things ran without Chloe's impulsiveness derailing the work. It wasn't gloating, just relief from people who finally understood the value of competence over connections. My revenge had never been loud. Never petty. Never emotional. It was structural. Permanent. The kind that didn't break rules, it enforced them. And in the end, Chloe's downfall wasn't because I fought her. It was because I stopped protecting her from the consequences she'd earned. Revenge didn't destroy her career. Her own arrogance did. And sometimes, the quietest justice is the one that lasts the longest.